The baby was still crying when Tony Wallace took 3 steps back. Not toward the window, not toward the door, away from his daughter. "That is not my child," he said, quietly. "Certainly." Like closing a deal. Nurse Amber Smith had worked 14 years in that delivery ward. She had never heard a room go that silent that fast. What she didn't know yet was that the silence had been planned. "No, that is not my daughter. Tony, please, she's right here. She needs you." "Sir, the DNA probability is 99.9999%. She is your child." The baby cried once, and Tony Wallace took those 3 steps backward again, as if the sound of his own daughter's voice had reached through the antiseptic air and found the one wound he had spent a lifetime making sure no one could see. "Don't bring her to me." His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. Men who shout can be forgiven. Losing control is at least honest. Tony Wallace didn't shout. He stood in the center of a private suite on the 14th floor of Manhattan's most expensive hospital, in a custom suit worth more than most people's monthly rent. And he chose his words the way he chose every deal he had ever closed. Cold, certain, final. "That baby is white." Cindy heard it from the bed. She was still bleeding, still trembling from 14 hours of labor. Her hair was matted against her face. Her hands hadn't stopped shaking since the final push. And the woman who had spent 3 years, trying to give this man a child, was lying in a hospital bed when she heard her husband decide, in front of doctors, nurses, and his own family, that she had betrayed him. Before I tell you what Nurse Amber Smith saw in that room, and what she found afterward, when she started pulling on threads that someone very powerful had hoped would never be touched, subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment below if stories about love, lies, and the truth that refuses to stay buried hit you the way they hit me. Because this one doesn't let go, and it only gets heavier from here. The delivery suite went still. Amber had been a labor and delivery nurse for 11 years. She had seen fathers faint from the smell of antiseptic. She had seen grown men weep so hard their knees gave out. She had once talked a man through a full panic attack while simultaneously coaching his wife through a contraction, and she had done it without raising her voice. She thought she had witnessed every version of what this room could become. She had never seen a man look at his newborn daughter and move away from her. "Mr. Wallace," she said carefully, keeping her voice level, "your wife needs calm right now." Tony's jaw tightened. His eyes hadn't moved from the baby. "My wife," he said slowly, "is going to need to start explaining herself." "Tony?" Cindy's voice came out barely above a breath. "What are you saying? What are you doing?" He didn't answer her. He answered the room. "I want a DNA test, tonight. I want every person standing in this room as a witness that I am formally requesting one. Immediately." The words landed harder than anything that had happened in the previous 14 hours. Amber looked at Cindy. What she saw there wasn't just shock. It was something older and slower, a kind of recognition that had clearly been building for months, rising quietly beneath the surface of whatever Cindy had been trying to protect herself from believing. As if some part of her had already known, before tonight, before the delivery, before the hospital gown and the IV, and the 14 hours of labor. Some part of her had already known that someone had been working on Tony's mind long before he ever walked through those doors. Amber looked toward the glass corridor. Victoria Wallace stood just beyond the doors. Tony's aunt, 60-something, immaculate. A dark, structured dress, pearl earrings, silver hair swept back with the kind of precision that doesn't happen by accident. She had been one of the first people called when Cindy's water broke, had arrived before the Obgyn, before Tony's lawyers, before almost anyone. She was not looking at the baby. She was not looking at Cindy. She was watching Tony, and her face held none of the things a face is supposed to hold in a moment like this. No horror, no confusion, no grief. What Victoria Wallace's face held, in the corridor outside her nephew's delivery suite, was the quiet and carefully contained expression of a woman watching a plan arrive exactly on schedule. That was the first thing Amber noticed. The second thing was the baby. The little girl had gone quiet. She lay against the attending nurse's chest, eyes barely open, and one tiny hand drifted upward, small fingers spreading apart, reaching blindly into the air, searching by pure instinct for the warmth and the voice and the heartbeat she had been listening to from inside the womb for 9 months. Tony didn't move. Not one step, not 1 inch. His hands that had signed contracts worth 9 figures, hands that had shaken the hands of senators and CEOs and world leaders, stayed exactly where they were. Cindy made a sound that Amber would struggle to describe later when she sat down to write her notes. It was too quiet to be a scream, too shattered to be a sob. It was the sound of a person realizing, in real time and without any warning, that the man she had built her entire life around had just become someone she didn't recognize. "Please," Cindy whispered, "please don't do this here. Not here." But humiliation has never once waited for a better moment. Tony turned to the attending physician. His voice had returned to the register he used in boardrooms, measured, authoritative, leaving no room for interpretation. "Nobody leaves this floor until I have legal confirmation of what I'm requesting." Then he straightened his jacket, walked past the bassinet, walked past his wife, walked out of the room while his daughter's small hand was still reaching into the air behind him. His daughter. He just didn't know it yet. 22 minutes earlier, Tony had been a completely different man. He had held Cindy's hand through every contraction, not loosely, not out of obligation, but gripping it the way people grip things when they are genuinely afraid of losing them. He had pressed his forehead against hers in hour 11, when the pain became too much, and whispered, low enough that only she could hear, "You are the strongest person I have ever known." When she cried from exhaustion somewhere around midnight, he had stepped to the corner of the room and cried too. Quickly, privately, pressing the back of his hand against his mouth so she wouldn't see, because he could not stand watching her suffer and not be able to fix it. And Tony Wallace had spent his entire adult life fixing things. That was who he had been at 11:38 p.m. By midnight, when the baby arrived and he saw her, pale skin, light eyes, features that matched nothing he had spent 9 months imagining, that man was simply gone. What replaced him was fear. Not anger, fear. That distinction mattered, because Tony Wallace had built one of the largest real estate empires in America by refusing, at every critical juncture, to be afraid of anything. He had started with nothing, a mother who worked 2 jobs, a childhood bedroom shared with 2 brothers, a scholarship that covered tuition but not rent, and turned nothing into $100 million, then turned that into a dynasty that stretched across 6 cities and employed over 3,000 people. His name was on hospital wings and scholarship funds, and the sides of buildings that changed skylines. Journalists described him with the same cluster of words, year after year: disciplined, visionary, untouchable. But there was one thing Tony had never let a journalist, or anyone else, see. He was terrified of being made a fool. It went back further than most people would have guessed. His father had been a proud man, the kind of proud that wears a good suit to church every Sunday, and shakes every hand in the room, and comes home smelling like someone else's perfume. Tony had grown up watching his mother hold herself together in public, while privately being slowly destroyed. He had watched her smile through dinners. He had watched her straighten her back in rooms full of people who already knew what she didn't want to admit. And by the time he was 15 years old, watching his father leave for the last time, Tony Wallace had made himself a single, ironclad promise. He would never be the man in the room who didn't know the truth about his own life. He had kept that promise for over 2 decades. He had built an entire empire around it, and then he met Cindy Taylor. She was an elementary school teacher from a small town in Ohio. She owned 3 pairs of shoes and rotated them to every event he invited her to, without apology. She had not searched his name online before their 3rd date. When he finally told her what he was worth, bracing, as he always did, for the shift in someone's eyes when the number landed, she had looked at him for a moment and said, "Okay, but can you cook? Because I genuinely cannot be with someone who doesn't know how to feed themselves." He had laughed so hard he knocked his water glass off the table. He fell for her because she was completely unimpressed. He married her because she was the only person in his life who made him feel like a man rather than a monument. Not a brand, not a legacy, not a name on a building. Just a person, sitting in a room, allowed to be quiet, allowed to be uncertain, allowed to be ordinary. Victoria Wallace had disliked Cindy from the moment they occupied the same room. "She doesn't understand what carrying the Wallace name requires," Victoria had told him, measured and composed, 3 months into the relationship. "She comes from a different world, Tony. Different expectations, different foundations. What she doesn't have," Tony had replied, is the need to perform for people who don't actually care about her. I've decided that's a quality, not a flaw. Victoria had smiled the small, patient smile she always used when she was deciding not to argue yet. She had always been better at waiting than Tony. For a while, for years, love held. Then came the fertility struggles, quiet and devastating and entirely private. Failed cycles, 2 miscarriages. Treatments that cost money Tony had plenty of, but still somehow felt like they were taking something from him he couldn't replace. Through all of it, he and Cindy had stayed close, stayed honest, stayed turned toward each other instead of away. But Tony carried something through all of it that Cindy never fully knew the shape of. Years before they met, after a serious car accident, after emergency surgery, after a recovery that had taken longer than anyone publicly acknowledged, a specialist had sat across from Tony in a consultation room and said something Tony had never repeated to another living person. The likelihood of you fathering a biological child is extremely low, Mr. Wallace, possibly negligible. I want you to have time to process that before making decisions about your future. He had buried it. The way he buried everything he couldn't negotiate or acquire or build his way out of. He had covered it with work and momentum and forward motion until it existed only as a dull weight at the very bottom of him that he had learned, over years, to simply carry without acknowledging. He had never told Cindy the whole truth of it, so when she came to him with the positive pregnancy test, hands shaking, eyes already filling, Tony had not responded the way she expected. He had gone completely still. Then he had laughed once, sharp and short and disbelieving. Then he had pulled her into his arms and held her with the kind of grip that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with someone clutching something they had stopped believing they would ever be allowed to have. He cried alone in his office that night. The kind of crying that only happens when a person has quietly, privately, over a very long time accepted that something is gone, and then, without any warning, it comes back. That was the man who had spent 14 hours holding Cindy's hand. And somewhere between that moment and midnight, someone had made sure his oldest and deepest fear followed him into that delivery room. What Nurse Amber Smith didn't know yet, what none of them knew, standing in that silent suite with the baby still reaching, and Cindy still shaking, and Victoria still watching from the corridor, was that the DNA test Tony had just demanded was never supposed to tell the truth. Someone had already made arrangements, and they had made them a long time ago. Nobody builds what Tony Wallace built without learning, early, that the world does not give you anything. He had understood that by age 9. His mother worked the early shift at a laundry facility in the Bronx, and the late shift at a diner 3 blocks over. And she did both without complaint, which was the first and most important lesson Tony ever received about dignity. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with a radiator that worked when it felt like it, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. Tony shared a room with his 2 younger brothers. He did his homework on the kitchen table after his mother left for the second job, by the light above the stove because the overhead bulb had burned out, and they were waiting until the first of the month. He was not bitter about any of it. He was motivated by it, which is a different thing entirely, and a much more dangerous one. By 22, he had his real estate license, a second-hand car, and a hunger that no one who had grown up comfortable could have fully understood. By 28, he had closed his first 8-figure deal. By 35, his name was on buildings in 4 cities and growing. By 40, Tony Wallace had become exactly what he had decided, standing in that kitchen at age 9, that he was going to become. The kind of man nobody could afford to dismiss. He met Cindy at an industry gala he hadn't wanted to attend. She was there as the +1 of a colleague, wearing a blue dress that was slightly too formal for her and heels she kept shifting her weight out of. She was the only person in the room who looked genuinely bored by the whole thing, and Tony, surrounded on all sides by people performing enthusiasm they didn't feel, found that so refreshing he walked straight over and told her so. She had looked at him, completely unimpressed, and said, "I'm bored because the salmon is overcooked and the speeches are too long." "Are you here to fix either of those things?" He had laughed, really laughed, for the first time in longer than he could remember. Everything else followed from that night, slowly, genuinely, in the way things grow when they aren't being forced. Cindy never wanted his money. She wanted his attention, his honesty, his time. She wanted him present at dinner instead of checking his phone. She wanted him to sit with her on Sunday mornings and do nothing useful at all. These were things no one had ever asked of Tony Wallace, because everyone around him had always treated his time as a resource to be extracted. Cindy treated it like a gift. He married her knowing she was the best decision he had ever made. The fertility struggles came quietly, then loudly, then as a kind of permanent weather neither of them could fully shelter from. 2 miscarriages. Rounds of treatment that required a hope Tony had to rebuild each time from scratch. Through all of it, they stayed facing each other, stayed honest, stayed close. But Tony carried one thing he never fully shared. Years before Cindy, before the empire, before everything, a car accident had put him in surgery for 6 hours and recovery for 3 months. Afterward, a specialist had told him something in a quiet room that Tony had immediately buried beneath every ambition he possessed. The chances of you fathering a child are extremely low, Mr. Wallace. He had never said those words aloud to another person, not once. Victoria knew, though. She had always known, had been the one who arranged the consultation, who sat in the waiting room that day, who drove him home afterward in silence, and she had never brought it up directly. That was not Victoria's way. Her way was gentler, more patient. You've been carrying so much, Tony. Fertility struggles are harder on men than people admit. I just worry about you, that's all. I hope you're not setting yourself up for more disappointment. Has Cindy seemed different to you lately? Distracted? I'm probably imagining things. Small questions, careful words, seeds dropped into soil she had been quietly preparing for months. Tony told himself he wasn't listening. Then, 3 weeks before Cindy's due date, his phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. A photograph. Cindy, laughing, walking beside a white man Tony didn't recognize, their shoulders almost touching, the angle of the shot suggesting something far more intimate than a sidewalk. Beneath it, 4 words. Is it really yours? Tony stared at the screen for a long time. Then he put his phone face down on his desk and said nothing to anyone. The first message had been easy enough to dismiss. Tony told himself it was a disgruntled competitor, someone who wanted to rattle him. He had made enemies the way all successful men do, not through cruelty necessarily, but through the simple act of winning in rooms where someone else expected to. Anonymous provocations came with the territory. He had received worse. He deleted the photograph and didn't mention it to Cindy. That was his first mistake. Because a week later, another message arrived. Different number, different image. Same man, caught this time outside a coffee shop, standing close enough to Cindy that the framing made distance look like a choice they had decided against. Then an email, no sender name, just a subject line. She's been seeing him for months. Then a voicemail, digitally distorted, someone reading off dates and locations like they were entries in a ledger. Each one arrived just far enough apart that Tony had time to almost recover before the next one landed. Whoever was sending them understood something important about doubt. It doesn't need to be proven, it only needs to be repeated. Victoria understood that too. She called more frequently now, dropped by the office with lunch, sat across from him with the careful, sorrowful expression of someone managing difficult news they weren't quite ready to deliver. You look exhausted, Tony. Is everything all right at home? Cindy seems stressed lately, probably just the pregnancy, though I've heard hormones can make people, I don't know, reckless. I'm not saying anything. I just think a man in your position should always know what's happening in his own house. She never accused, never pushed. She simply arrived, watered the seed, and left. Tony, to his own shame, let her. Cindy noticed the change, the way you notice weather shifting. Gradually, then all at once. He stopped reaching for her hand first. He answered her questions with the minimum number of words required. He came to bed after she was already asleep and was gone before she woke. At dinner, his phone stayed face down in a way it never used to, and when she asked him once, lightly, if everything was okay at work, he said fine, in a tone that meant the conversation was over. The argument started small, a forgotten appointment, a miscommunication about plans, but underneath each one ran something heavier, something neither of them named directly because naming it would have made it real. Then one evening, 7 weeks before her due date, Cindy walked into Tony's home office looking for a phone charger. He was at his desk. On his screen, pulled up in a browser window he hadn't heard her approach in time to close, was a document she recognized, his old medical file. The specialist's report, the consultation from years ago, the one he had mentioned only once, briefly, and then never returned to. He closed the laptop. She stood in the doorway. The silence between them lasted a long time. "Tony," her voice was quiet. "Talk to me." "It's nothing." He didn't look at her. "I was just reviewing some old paperwork." "That wasn't paperwork. That was—" "Cindy." His voice came out harder than he intended. "Please." She didn't push. She was 8 months pregnant and exhausted, and she loved him, which meant she was still, even then, trying to protect him from whatever was hurting him. She left the room without her charger. Tony sat in the dark for a long time afterward. 6 weeks later, at 9:47 p.m., Cindy appeared in the bedroom doorway, gripping the doorframe, her face pale and her breathing changed. "Tony," he was on his feet before she finished saying his name. Whatever had been living between them, the silence, the distance, the weight of everything unspoken, fell away the instant he reached her. He grabbed her hospital bag from the closet shelf where it had been waiting for 3 weeks. He got her coat. He got her to the car. He drove with one hand on the wheel and one hand covering hers. And somewhere on the bridge, with the city blazing beneath them, Cindy laughed once through a contraction, short and breathless, and said, "You're running every red light." "I know," Tony said. "We're going to get pulled over." "Let them pull us over." She laughed again. He squeezed her hand tighter. For 22 minutes, crossing that bridge, they were exactly who they had always been to each other. Then they reached the hospital. And everything that came next, you already know. By 6 a.m., it was everywhere. Tony Wallace had not issued a statement. His lawyers had not confirmed anything. No spokesperson had spoken to any reporter. And yet, by the time the sun came up over Manhattan, the story had already outrun all of them. Billionaire questions paternity of newborn. Wallace refuses to hold baby. Demands immediate Domena test. Is the Wallace heir really his? Someone inside that hospital had made a phone call, or sent a text, or sold 4 sentences to the right person for the right price. It didn't matter how. What mattered was that by morning, Cindy Taylor Wallace, a woman who had spent 14 hours in labor and was still recovering in a hospital bed, had become a headline. The comments were worse than the headlines. Social media had already tried her, convicted her, and begun writing the narrative of her guilt with the casual cruelty that platforms make so easy. Strangers who had never heard her name yesterday were now confident authorities on her character. Her old photographs were being pulled and reposted with captions. Someone had found her social media and screenshotted 3 years of her life out of context. She didn't know any of it yet. She was still in her room, holding her daughter. Tony, by contrast, knew everything. His legal team had arrived before breakfast. 3 attorneys in dark suits who set up in a private consultation room down the hall and began doing what lawyers do when a powerful man makes a public mistake. They built walls around it. Injunctions, statements, strategic silences. Tony sat with them for 2 hours and said very little. He had not slept. His eyes were dry and distant in the way of someone who has moved past the point where emotion is useful and entered the colder territory of damage control. He had not gone back to Cindy's room. Victoria arrived mid-morning, composed as always, carrying coffee she had purchased from somewhere outside the hospital, as though this were an ordinary visit. "You're doing the right thing," she told Tony quietly, in the corridor outside the consultation room. "A man in your position cannot afford to simply accept. He has to know. No one can fault you for wanting the truth." Tony said nothing. "The lawyers will handle the noise," she continued. "Just hold your position. Don't apologize. An apology before the results come back looks like admission of something else entirely." She patted his arm once and walked away. Amber watched her go. She had been watching Victoria all morning, the way you watch something that moves too smoothly, too deliberately, in a building full of people who are genuinely distressed. Everyone else on the floor was operating in the register of crisis, nurses speaking in lowered voices, the attending physician checking in more frequently than protocol required. Even the administrative staff moved with the careful energy of people aware that something significant was happening nearby. Victoria moved like she was on schedule. She hovered near the nursing station twice, each time drifting close enough to overhear without appearing to listen. She took 2 phone calls in the corridor, turning away, shoulders angled inward, voice dropping to just below audible. When a junior nurse approached her once to ask if she needed anything, Victoria smiled so warmly that the nurse thanked her and left, without remembering what she'd originally intended to ask. Amber noticed all of it. She wrote none of it down yet, but she kept watching. Down the hall, Cindy was alone with her daughter for the first time. The room was quiet in the way hospital rooms are quiet. Not peaceful exactly, but hollowed out. The morning light came through the blinds in thin strips. The baby was awake, dark blue eyes open and unfocused, doing the slow, searching thing that newborns do when they are trying to locate the world. Cindy looked at her for a long time. Then she pulled her closer, pressed her lips to the top of her head, and whispered against her daughter's soft hair words that no mother should have to say in the first hours of her child's life. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry this is how your father welcomed you. I'm sorry you came into a room full of noise instead of love." She paused. "But I want you to know something. Whatever happens out there, whatever they say, whatever he believes right now, I know the truth, and I am not going anywhere." The baby made a small sound and turned her face instinctively toward her mother's warmth. Cindy closed her eyes. At 11:14 a.m., Amber went to check on the DNA sample status. The lab technician on duty pulled up the file, scrolled for a moment, then frowned at his screen. Problem?" Amber asked. "Sample's been flagged for secondary verification." He scrolled further. "Rerouted to an external processing facility." He looked up. "That's unusual for an in-house collection." "Who authorized the reroute?" He checked again. Scrolled. Checked once more. "That's the thing," he said slowly. "I can't find an authorization on file." Amber looked at the screen. Then she looked down the corridor toward where Victoria Wallace had just taken her third phone call of the morning. Something cold and certain settled in her chest. She went back to her station, sat down, and began paying a very different kind of attention. Amber had a rule she had carried since her first year on the ward. If something feels wrong in a hospital, it usually is. Not always dramatically, not always obviously. Sometimes it was just a number that didn't track, a signature in the wrong place, a sequence of events that moved in a direction that made no clinical sense. In 11 years, that instinct had caught 2 medication errors, one falsified discharge form, and a billing irregularity that turned out to be significantly larger than anyone initially wanted to admit. It had never felt quite like this. She started with the paperwork. The DNA sample collected from Tony, Cindy, and the baby should have been processed internally, standard protocol for a paternity test requested through the hospital's own legal intake system. The results timeline, 18 to 24 hours, straightforward, unremarkable. Instead, the sample had been flagged for external verification within 40 minutes of collection, rerouted to a facility across the city. No authorization signature on file. When Amber called the external lab directly, she was told the sample had been received, but that processing was delayed pending documentation from the referring physician. When she called the referring physician's office, they had no record of making a referral. She wrote everything down in the small notebook she kept in her scrubs pocket. Dates, times, names, exactly who told her what and when. Then she called Marcus. Marcus Webb had been a lab technician for 16 years. First at this hospital, and now at a private diagnostic center 2 miles north. He was meticulous, discreet, and owed Amber a favor from a situation 3 years ago that neither of them ever discussed openly. When she texted him, "Can you talk?" "Off the record," he called her back within 10 minutes. She told him what she had found. He was quiet for a moment. "Send me the sample ID number," he said. She did. She waited. He called back, 22 minutes later. "Amber." His voice had changed. "That sample has been redirected 3 times. 3 different facilities in the last 14 hours. Each one received it, logged it, and then transferred it out before running any analysis. The documentation trail at each stop is either incomplete or inconsistent." She kept her voice steady. "What does that mean?" "It means someone is moving it around deliberately, keeping it in transit so no results can be finalized." A pause. "This isn't a paperwork problem. Someone is running out the clock." She thanked him. Hung up, sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she kept going. Tony saw Cindy at 2 p.m. He hadn't meant to. He was moving through the corridor with one of his attorneys, heading back toward the consultation room, when the door to Cindy's room opened and a nurse stepped out. leaving the door ajar just long enough. Cindy was sitting up in bed. Her daughter was against her chest, both of them still. Cindy's head was bent over the baby's, her lips moving slightly, saying something too quiet to reach the corridor. Her free hand was moving in slow circles on the baby's back. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had been through something enormous and was choosing, in spite of it, to remain gentle. Tony stopped walking. His attorney said something. Tony didn't hear it. He stood in the corridor for 4 seconds, maybe 5, and in that time something moved across his face that hadn't been there since midnight. Not certainty, not anger, something closer to shame. Then the door swung closed and he kept walking. He didn't say anything to his attorney. He didn't say anything to anyone. At 4:30 p.m., Amber found an envelope in her locker. No stamp, no return address. Her name, written on the front in clean, careful handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside, a single card. No letterhead, no signature. There are things about this situation you deserve to understand. Come alone. The parking structure on Kellner Street. Level 2.7 p.m. tonight. Tell no one. Amber read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and put it in her pocket alongside her notebook. She thought about Marcus's voice on the phone. Someone is running out the clock. She thought about Victoria Wallace standing in the corridor, perfectly composed, taking phone calls no one was supposed to overhear. She thought about Cindy in that room, bent over her daughter, choosing gentleness anyway. Amber clocked out at 6:15 p.m. and drove to Kellner Street. Level 2 of the Kellner Street parking structure was empty, except for a single black car idling near the far wall. Amber walked toward it slowly, her footsteps tracking against the concrete, the hum of the ventilation system the only other sound. The driver's window stayed up. The rear door opened instead. A man stepped out, 50-something, well-dressed in the particular way of people whose job is to appear unremarkable while representing someone who is not. No introduction, no handshake. He held a manila envelope at his side, the way people carry things they've carried before. Ms. Smith, not a question. He already knew her name. Thank you for coming. I haven't agreed to anything yet, Amber said. Who are you? Someone authorized to make you a straightforward offer. He held out the envelope. She didn't take it. He set it on the hood of the car between them. $250,000. Deposited wherever you direct, in whatever structure your accountant recommends. He paused. All you need to do is nothing. Continue your shift. Answer questions the way you've been answering them. Don't pursue the sample transfer issue any further. Amber looked at the envelope. Then she looked at him. Someone already knows what the DNA results are going to say, she said. It wasn't a question either. The man's expression didn't change, which was, itself, an answer. The offer is generous and time-sensitive, he said. I'd encourage you not to treat it as a negotiation. I'm not negotiating, Amber said. She picked up the envelope and held it out until he took it back. I'm declining. She walked back to her car without looking behind her. She didn't go home. She drove to the hospital, badged in through the side entrance, and sat down at the terminal in the records annex that she technically had access to, and that, at 8 p.m. on a weekday, no one else was using. She had a name from the old file Marcus had referenced during their call. The specialist on Tony's original post-surgery consultation, Dr. Gerald Reynolds. She started there. Reynolds wasn't on staff at this hospital and never had been. He ran a small private practice, sports medicine and post-surgical rehabilitation, that had apparently been quite profitable for a number of years before going quiet around a decade ago. Almost no recent activity, no publications, no conference appearances. Amber pulled his licensing records, active but inactive in practice. She cross-referenced his billing history through a professional database her hospital subscription accessed for insurance purposes. And there it was. Not obvious, not crude, the kind of transaction that would look like nothing to someone who wasn't already looking. Consulting fees, paid across 14 months, routed through 2 intermediary accounts before landing in Reynolds's practice. But the origin point of those payments, when she traced it back carefully, connected to a property management company whose registered agent was a name Amber recognized immediately. Victoria Wallace. She sat back. The original fertility diagnosis. The private consultation arranged years before Tony met Cindy. The verdict that had burrowed into Tony's confidence and lived there ever since. quietly shaping every fear he carried into that delivery room. It had been purchased. Someone had told Tony Wallace he could never father a child, and that someone had been paid to say it. Her phone buzzed at 9:47 p.m. "Marcus," she answered before the second vibration. "I called in everything I had," he said without preamble. "Independent processing, completely outside the chain that's been compromised." A pause. "Amber, the report is done. And? I'm sending it now." The document loaded slowly. She opened it. Strolled to the result field. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. Amber read it once. Then again. Then she sat very still in the empty records room, the screen's light the only brightness in the corridor, and understood with complete clarity that what she was holding wasn't just a DNA result. It was the evidence of how far someone had been willing to go, and how much further she was going to have to go to make sure it saw daylight. It looks like Chapter 6 was already written in our previous exchange. Here's Chapter 7 to keep the story moving forward. Amber didn't sleep. She sat in her car in the hospital parking structure until past midnight, the DNA report open on her phone, the financial records printed and folded in her jacket pocket, and a question turning slowly in her mind that she couldn't yet answer. She had the truth. That part was done. What she didn't have yet was the full shape of it, because in her experience, when someone builds a conspiracy this carefully, this patiently, over this many years, they don't do it for a simple reason. Simple reasons don't require purchased doctors and rerouted lab samples and unmarked envelopes in parking structures. She went back inside and kept digging. The Wallace family archive wasn't something Amber could access from a hospital terminal, but public records were a different matter. Property filings, estate documents, probate records from decades past. She worked through them methodically, the way she worked through a patient's chart when something wasn't adding up. Not looking for anything specific, just following the thread until the picture clarified. It clarified at 1:30 a.m. A probate filing from 1987. The estate of Edward Wallace, Tony's grandfather. A straightforward document on its surface, distributing assets among named family members. But attached to it, almost invisible in the administrative language of the appendix, was a separate deed transfer. Property in upstate New York. Transferred not to any Wallace family member listed in the main document, but to a woman named Catherine Marsh. Amber searched for the name. Catherine Marsh had 2 children, both born in the late 1960s. Their birth certificates listed no father, but a secondary document, a private settlement, part of a civil matter that had been sealed and then quietly unsealed when the relevant parties died, named Edward Wallace as the biological father of both. Catherine Marsh was white. Amber set down her pen. She thought about the baby in room 412, the pale skin and light eyes that had sent Tony backward across a delivery room floor, the appearance that had seemed, to a man operating on fear and poisoned information, like incontrovertible evidence of betrayal. It wasn't evidence of anything except genetics. Tony Wallace carried, in his own blood, the exact biological history that explained his daughter's face. His family had simply spent 40 years making sure he never knew it. Victoria knew. That was the piece that settled into place last. And coldest. Victoria was Edward Wallace's niece. She had grown up inside the family during the years the secret was being actively maintained. She had been present for the decisions, the payments, the careful erasure of Catherine Marsh and her children from the official Wallace story. And when Cindy became pregnant, when there was suddenly a child coming who might, by the pure logic of heredity, look nothing like what the Wallace family publicly presented itself as, Victoria had moved, not impulsively, not angrily, methodically. The fertility diagnosis first. Plant the doubt years in advance. Then the anonymous messages during the pregnancy. Then the slow, patient cultivation of Tony's fear through every carefully worded conversation. Then the DNA interference, the bribe, the entire architecture of a lie, built to accomplish one thing: make Tony reject his daughter before he ever knew her. Protect the family's version of itself at the cost of a child's father. Amber gathered everything: the DNA report, the financial records, the probate documents, the payment trail to Reynolds, and organized it into a single, irrefutable sequence. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She looked up. Through the narrow window in the records room door, she saw Victoria Wallace moving through the hallway with the focused, purposeful stride of someone who had just realized something was no longer going according to plan. Their eyes met through the glass for exactly 1 second. Victoria stopped walking. Amber didn't look away. Amber requested the meeting at 7 a.m. She didn't ask. She told Tony's lead attorney that she had documentation requiring his client's immediate attention, that it was time-sensitive, and that if Mr. Wallace preferred, she could make the same materials available to the 3 journalists who had been calling the hospital's press line since yesterday morning. Tony was in the consultation room within 20 minutes. Amber laid everything on the table without preamble. The DNA report first. She placed it directly in front of him and let him read it without speaking. She watched his eyes move across the page, watched them stop, watched him read it again. Then the financial records, the payment trail from Victoria's property management company to the intermediary accounts to Dr. Reynolds's practice, across 14 months, for a consultation that had told Tony Wallace something that wasn't true. Then the probate documents, Catherine Marsh, Edward Wallace. 2 children whose existence the family had spent 4 decades erasing. Then the lab transfer logs, every reroute, every missing authorization, every facility that had received the sample and passed it along before running a single test. She set each document down slowly and said nothing, because the evidence didn't need her voice. Tony sat very still through all of it. When he reached the end, he put both hands flat on the table and stared at the surface for a long time. "Where is she?" he said quietly. They found Victoria in the corridor near the elevators, coat on, bag over her shoulder. She saw Tony's face and stopped walking. Whatever composure she had maintained across the previous 36 hours, the perfect posture, the careful words, the expression of a woman managing a situation rather than causing one, it didn't survive the look on her nephew's face. "Tony, don't!" His voice was low and absolutely controlled, which was worse than shouting. "Don't say my name like that. Not right now." The attorney laid the documents on the chair beside Victoria without a word. She looked at them for a long time. Then something in her shoulders changed. A slow, almost architectural collapse. The kind that happens when a structure built over decades finally meets the one thing it wasn't designed to withstand. "She wasn't right for you," Victoria said. Her voice had lost its polish. What was underneath was older and uglier. "She never understood what this family is, what it carries, what it costs. And when I found out she was pregnant, I knew that child could come out looking exactly like family," Tony said. "Like my family." Victoria went quiet. "You paid a doctor to make me believe I couldn't have children." He said it slowly, like someone pressing on a wound to confirm it's real. "You built a lie, and you handed it to me, and then you spent years making sure I never put it down." He paused. "And when my daughter was born, you let me walk away from her." Victoria didn't answer. There was nothing left to say that the documents hadn't already said more clearly. Tony stood outside Cindy's door for a long time before he opened it. The Chapter 8 callback. You already know what happened next. His hands trembling. The bassinet. The reaching. 4 fingers the size of pencil erasers closing around his. What the callback didn't capture was the sound he made. It wasn't a sob. It wasn't a word. It was something that came from deeper than either. The sound of a man who had built walls around every vulnerable thing he possessed and was now, in a hospital room at 7:30 in the morning, feeling all of them come down at once. He held his daughter for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, Cindy was watching him from the bed. She hadn't moved toward him. She hadn't spoken. Her eyes were red, and her expression held everything at once: the grief, the anger, the exhaustion, and underneath all of it, buried but still breathing, the love that had survived 14 months of someone else's careful demolition. "Cindy," his voice broke on the second syllable. "I don't have words that are big enough." She looked at him holding their daughter. "I know," she said quietly, "but you're going to have to find some anyway." He nodded. He pressed his lips to his daughter's forehead. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making this right," he said. "Both of you. Whatever it takes, however long it takes." He looked at Cindy. "I know I don't deserve that chance. I'm asking for it anyway." The baby made a small sound against his chest and turned her face toward his heartbeat. Tony closed his eyes. For the first time since midnight 2 days ago, he stopped being a billionaire, a brand, a dynasty, a headline. He was just a father, holding his daughter, beginning, at enormous cost, to understand what that actually meant. Tony called the press conference for noon. No handlers shaped the statement. No communications team softened the language. He stood at a podium in the hospital's ground floor atrium, his daughter's name bracelet still on his wrist, because he had asked the nurse if he could keep it, and she had said yes without asking why, and he spoke without notes. 2 days ago, I stood in a delivery room and rejected my newborn daughter because of how she looked. He paused. Let it sit. There is no version of that sentence that doesn't belong entirely to me. Not to the people who manipulated me, not to my fears, not to my history, to me. I made that choice, and my wife and my daughter bore the cost of it. K. The room was very quiet. Cindy Wallace never betrayed me. Not once. Not in any form. Everything I believed was constructed by someone I trusted, using fears I was too proud to examine. Another pause. My daughter is my child. She always was, and I walked away from her. A journalist near the front raised a hand. Tony shook his head once. I'm not taking questions today. I just needed the record to be straight. He stepped back from the podium and walked away while the cameras were still running. The consequences came quickly and without mercy. Victoria Wallace was removed from every Wallace family board position within 72 hours. The financial records Amber had uncovered were turned over to investigators, and within 2 weeks, a formal inquiry had begun into the payments to Dr. Reynolds, the interference with the DNA process, and the decades-old suppression of Edward Wallace's second family. Reynolds surrendered his medical license before the investigation formally requested it. The story ran everywhere. Journalists who had spent 2 days writing about Cindy's alleged infidelity spent the next 2 weeks writing about Victoria's orchestration of the entire scandal. The narrative shifted completely and permanently. Victoria did not comment publicly. She didn't need to. The documents said everything. 6 months passed. Not easily. Not in a straight line. Healing rarely does either of those things. Tony learned that fatherhood operates entirely outside the skill set that builds empires. It does not reward confidence or decisiveness or the ability to command a room. It rewards patience, the 3 a.m. kind, the kind that nobody sees and nobody applauds, the kind that asks everything of you on the nights when you have nothing left. He learned the particular mathematics of a diaper change performed with insufficient sleep and insufficient light. He learned that a baby who has decided she is hungry at 4 a.m. has more negotiating leverage than anyone Tony had ever sat across a table from. He learned that the sound of his daughter settling against his chest, the small exhale, the weight of her relaxing completely, was something no amount of money could have purchased or prepared him for. Cindy watched all of it. She didn't rush. She didn't perform forgiveness before she felt it. She gave Tony the room to prove himself in the small, unglamorous daily ways that actually mean something. And she allowed herself, slowly and on her own terms, to let him back in. Some nights they talked for hours. Some nights the distance was still there, quieter than before but present. Both of them knew that what had been broken wasn't going to be invisible just because it had been repaired. That was the truth they were both learning to live inside. On a Tuesday evening in early spring, Tony was in the nursery alone. The room was soft and dim, the city a distant glow beyond the curtains. His daughter had been fussy for 20 minutes. The particular restless fussiness that has no diagnosable cause and requires only time and closeness, and the willingness to simply stay. Tony had stayed. He sat in the chair by the window and held her against his chest and moved slowly back and forth and said nothing, because he had learned that she didn't need his words. She needed his presence. Gradually, her breathing changed. The small fists unclenched. Her head grew heavy against him in the specific way that means a child has decided, completely and without reservation, that she is safe. She fell asleep. Tony didn't move. He sat in the dim room with his daughter sleeping on his chest and the city glowing softly beyond the glass, and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not managing anything, not building anything, not protecting or projecting or performing, just here. He became aware, after a moment, of a presence in the doorway. Cindy. She was leaning against the frame in the quiet way she had, arms folded loosely, watching them. She hadn't announced herself. She had just arrived and stayed, the way she had always done, present without demanding anything from the moment. Tony met her eyes across the dim room. Cindy looked at her husband holding the daughter he had once refused to touch, in the room they had put together before any of it happened, in the life that had nearly been destroyed and was now, imperfectly and deliberately and one day at a time, being rebuilt. And for the first time since the night their daughter was born, she smiled. Not a performance, not forgiveness packaged for his comfort, just a smile, small and real, and entirely hers. Tony felt it land somewhere deeper than anything else had reached in a very long time. He had built towers. He had built companies. He had built a name that people recognized in cities he had never visited. He had constructed from nothing an empire that would outlast him. None of it compared to this. None of it had ever required this much of him or given this much back. The greatest thing Tony Wallace ever built wasn't a billion-dollar empire. It was the family he had nearly destroyed and had the humility and the courage and the grace of a second chance to spend every remaining day of his life being worthy of. Some men spend their lives building fortunes. Tony Wallace almost lost everything before discovering that the most valuable thing he would ever hold was the daughter he once refused to touch.